from the world of politics.
We've got to play the long game here. Our kids have suffered really severe consequences. And yes, public health is important. Their health is important, but they're struggling mightily.
To the world of business.
The rolling off the balance sheet, I expect, will be something that they'll commit to over a long period of time so as not to roil the markets.
This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. President Biden marks the end of the first year in office with a news conference this afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. To set the stage, we turn now to Washington correspondent Joe Matthew, host of Sound On weekdays on ABC Radio. Joe, great to see you again there at the White House. So it's not just a news conference, it's a pretty rare news conference. I checked, I think the last time we did one of these was in November before the president went to COP26. So to what do we owe the pleasure of the president's company?
Well, to your point, David, it is marking the end of his first year in office. Main event starts in just about 4 hours. The second, only second solo formal news conference for this president at this White House here. And of course, this is a year that's been marked by some major wins and some major losses. And the president's going to try to redirect the narrative back to the accomplishments, the American Rescue Plan, which I know you'll be talking about in a moment with Gene Sperling as well, the infrastructure law. That narrative, of course, has been challenged by COVID, by inflation, by the failure of Build Back Better, and the looming expected failure today of voting rights legislation. David, votes are set for the U.S. Senate after the president holds his news conference here at the White House. If it doesn't pass, it's not expected to. Democrats don't have the votes. They will move on with an attempt, as we've discussed, to kill the filibuster. That's also expected to fail. The president could have some very tough questions on this. This is a matter that is considered a moral issue for progressive Democrats. But beyond policy, David, this is a performance. We have to remind you, this is an international broadcast that this president will be leading, and we're going to be looking very closely at his demeanor, his body language, and the way he navigates between topics and the way he handles reporters. There's new polling data out this morning from Morning Consult, David, that shows majorities are questioning this president's ability to lead effectively, to communicate effectively, and to make good on his promises, David.
Well, and that leads me, at least, Joe, to the question, how does he regain momentum? There's a general perception, I think, maybe even in the White House, but certainly outside the White House, that he's lost momentum. Whatever the accomplishments of the first year, and you're right, there were accomplishments there. Right now, he's sort of back on his heels. How does he turn that around?
Well, that is a big question, and it's one they're trying to answer inside that building behind me here. There is hope, though, that COVID starts to come back a little bit from the Omicron variant. We are seeing signs of Omicron cresting in other countries. That would go a long way to potentially solving the inflation issue as well. Inflation is going to be a major issue as the president works his way into this midterm election year. I would also look for this White House to start picking up the pieces from Build Back Better. If they can find a vehicle to pass some of those issues, even as standalone bills, think the child tax credit, think universal pre-K, could go a long way to helping the narrative as they try to maintain control on Capitol Hill later this year.
Thanks so much to Sound On host Joe Matthew. You can hear him live at 5 p.m. Eastern Time this afternoon and every afternoon on Bloomberg Radio. For her take on where the administration stands at the end of its first full year, we welcome now Libby Cantrell. She is head of public policy at PIMCO. So great to have you back with us. Happy New Year, Libby. A little late, but Happy New Year. So give us your sense of the report card right now. As Joe says, they did accomplish some things in the first year. At the same time, right now, they seem a bit stalled.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think for the first 6 months looked quite different from the last 6 months of this first year of the administration. Of course, the first 6 months saw the passage of the American Rescue Plan, lots of momentum from a regulatory perspective in terms of sort of setting out a roadmap on climate. But the second half, even though it's important to note that Democrats were able to, working with Republicans, pass the bipartisan infrastructure framework, or the BIF, the public works bill that both Trump and Obama were not able to pass, the messaging has gotten very kind of muddled, partly because of Build Back Better, partly because, of course, the surge in Omicron, but also some of these sort of foreign policy arguably unforced errors as it relates to Afghanistan and some other areas. So, I think that, again, the first half was better than the second half, but we're only a year in. The electorate, of course, is fickle, and you're starting to see that in poll data. But it's absolutely possible for this administration to pivot. They just need to, pivot quickly in advance of the midterm elections.
Well, and particularly, how do they pivot with Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, for that matter, Kristen Sinema from Arizona, because they seem to have stalled in various places. What about breaking up the Build Back Better? Is that realistic? Everybody from the outside says that's what they should do, but is it harder to do than it says?
It is harder to do than it sounds, partly because the way they're trying to pass this Build Back Better agenda is through something called reconciliation, which only takes 50 votes, not 60. If they were to break up these vehicles, they really just couldn't do that mechanically. They would then need to work with Republicans to get that 60 vote threshold, and that seems unlikely. So I think our view is they will try again to revive Build Back Better. It will look different from the House version that passed last year. But our view is that there's still a chance that they can get this done. There's more agreement than disagreement here, but just given sort of the frosty relations between Senator Manchin and some of the other moderate Senate Democrats and the White House, there needs to be a pivot. But still, we think it is possible. And we also think it's good politics. We all know from the polling that the economy is one big concern for American voters. And so Biden could point to this as, addressing those concerns. But again, this needs to happen pretty quickly in order to be politically resonant.
Is voting a big concern for Americans? Because that certainly is what the White House has been really devoting a lot of time and attention to in the last couple of weeks or so. Looks like we're going to have some votes in the Senate that basically won't go the president's way. We're told that's because they want to get people on the record for purposes of the next election. Is this likely to make a difference come November?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's an open question. What we know right now is that voters are most concerned about the economy, particularly inflation. And then, of course, related to that is COVID. But to your point, is this more of an effort to embolden the progressive base, to also show that they're kind of at their limit in terms of what they can do legislatively? Maybe, but the timing is awkward here for the president. He wants to use this press conference to sort of celebrate wins, and he's going to have a failure 2 hours later in terms of voting rights and changing the filibuster. So the timing is a little bit befuddling here. And again, I think you're going to see the administration pivot very quickly back to economic issues and to COVID after this exercise of voting rights.
Libby, you have no doubt on the midterm elections. And of course, you don't have a position on what should happen, but you just go back through history and what is likely to happen given where we are right now. You even have a regression analysis in there. I was very impressed by that when it comes to elections. But give us your snapshot right now. If the election were held today for the midterms, what would happen?
Yeah, we're bond nerds, so we like numbers. Using a very kind of reductive regression analysis that takes into account the generic ballot and the president's approval rating, you would see if the election were held today, which is a big caveat, David, sort of losses in between kind of 40 to 45 seats in the House, and then, probably about 3 seats in the Senate. Now, a lot can change between now and then. The macro environment can change. COVID can change. We could also see Roe v. Wade emboldening some Democrats to go to vote in the midterm. So a lot can change. But as of right now, this is not looking particularly good for Democrats. And as you've noted, usually the midterm elections are a referendum on the sitting president. And usually there are losses of the president's party. So this is not unusual, but they could be more acute just based where President Biden's approval rating is.
And finally, Libby, we have a viewer writing in with a really good question, I think, which is we've got 3.9% unemployment, way faster. We got the unemployment down than we would have expected. The markets are really quite strong. They're having a little turbulence right now. We have some inflation, but the Fed says they're going to get under control. Normally, you'd say that's a pretty good record when it comes to pocketbook issues.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, on the growth side, this is quite rosy. Now, the inflation is the big open question. Our view is that we will see core CPI likely peaking in February or March, and then likely normalizing. So again, this is why I caveat that things could look quite different in November. Should the administration be able to get inflation under control? Should COVID sort of recede? Again, the backdrop could look quite different for the midterm elections. But right now, as we said, it is not looking good for Democrats if the election were held today.
Okay, it's great to see you, Libby. Thank you so much for being with us. That's Libby Cantrill. She's PIMCO Head of Public Policy. Coming up, we go to the White House and Senior Advisor to President Biden, Gene Sperling, for his assessment of the president's first year. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken offered a show of U.S. support to Ukraine in meetings with the country's leaders in Kiev today. The Biden administration is trying to head off a Russian invasion it says could happen at any moment. Secretary Blinken said diplomacy is still the best option and that his meeting with Russia's foreign ministers set for Friday will help determine whether Moscow is bent on war or is willing to negotiate over its concerns and de-escalate. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is dismissing calls for him to resign over alleged breaches of lockdown rules, including one from a former cabinet colleague. Conservative MP David Davis spoke up as the Prime Minister battled through his weekly interrogation in Parliament today.
I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
Prime Minister Johnson responded to Mr. Davis's remarks, saying, quote, "I don't know what he's talking about," which drew cheers from his party's faithful. Earlier today, one of the Prime Minister's MPs defected to the opposition Labor Party. New York's Attorney General has asked a judge to order Donald Trump and two of his adult children to testify under oath as part of the state's ongoing civil probe into the family real estate business. Letitia James says investigators have uncovered the former president likely used fraudulent valuations to misstate the value of his assets. The Trumps say the investigation is politically motivated. A judge has already rejected that argument at least twice. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. It's one thing to view an administration's first year from the outside. It's very different when you're on the inside. Gene Sperling has been there 3 different times as director of the Economic Council under both President Clinton and President Biden and President Clinton and President Obama, and now is senior advisor to President Biden and coordinator of the American Rescue Plan. So, Gene, welcome. Great to have you with us. So give us your sense of how it looks from inside the White House right now on this one-year anniversary.
Well, I think we very much remember what this president inherited. What was projected, the amount of pain that was in the economy, and what has happened with the result of the American Rescue Plan. Now, David, there's no secret that everywhere in the world there are challenges with prices and supply chains. You just saw the UK today at 5.4%. But what is different in the United States is not that we're also struggling with some of those issues, but that with the powerful American Rescue Plan, look at what we're seeing in terms of growth, in terms of jobs. And also, very important issue in terms of the lack of increase in harm, scarring to workers entering this workforce. So not only is the United States the only country that reached its GDP level at the end of the second quarter, there were no other G7 countries that had even reached that measure by the end of the third quarter. The 3.9% in unemployment rate that we're in was not projected by CBO for 4 years from this point. The 6.4 million jobs is the largest we have on record. The second largest was 1946 after World War II. But I also want to point a little bit on some of the things we saw when, after the Great Recession that hurt the recovery or hurt a lot of people in the recovery. One, we see evictions at 60% of where they were historically due to the American Rescue Plan. Foreclosures are 1/3 of just historic levels. So evictions and foreclosures are better than they were in non-pandemic regular years. Credit card delinquencies have set record lows for the last 3 quarters. The number of long-term unemployed, which hovered at over 6 million in the recovery after the Great Recession, is now at 2 million. And the drop from 4 million to 2 million this year is the largest drop in history, and young people. Remember, after the Great Recession, the fact that there was 17% unemployment rates for young people meant many of them were scarred. What economists said is having that weak of a labor market hurt people for years. What's it now? 8.2%. It's actually one of the lowest it's been. It's been dropping quickly. So, yes, we're going to do everything we can, medium, short term, long term, on supply, on prices. But it's very important for people to remember how strong this recovery is in terms of growth and jobs and preventing the kind of long-term harms that we've seen after other similar deep recessions.
So, Gene, let me ask you a couple questions about some of these things. On the American Rescue Plan overall, you say, and I think a lot of people agree, that it really gave a big help to a lot of people. Where are we with the program in this sense? A certain amount of money was appropriated. How much has actually been dispersed? How much is left to be dispersed at this point?
Well, here's the issue. A lot of the American Rescue Plan, for example, probably a third, went to state, local governments, superintendents, child care centers. In a lot of those areas, that money is obligated. It is being planned for spending, but it doesn't mean it's all spent out. So to give you an example, if a school district said, we're going to double the amount of first to third grade teachers, and we're going to budget for hiring these teachers for the next 3 years, well, if you'd only paid them the first 3 or 4 months, you could say, well, only 10% of that money went out. But it doesn't accurately reflect the fact that money is committed and obligated. What we are pushing, though, and I said this today speaking to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, we are asking people to step up their efforts to retain workers, to bring workers back to better jobs. But I do think the important thing to also remember is part of this is a feature, not a bug of the American Rescue Plan. This was lessons learned, David. We knew that when you come back from a deep recession, you don't want to be able to just jumpstart the economy. You want to ensure that you've got the financial firepower and flexibility to ensure the recovery is durable, equitable, and can deal with known unknowns like the issues we've seen with variants.
Right, but Gene, don't misunderstand me. When I'm asking how much was dispersed, I wasn't suggesting it was a bad thing. It hasn't been dispersed. In some ways, it could be a good thing because there's more money coming. So overall, do you have a sense of how much money is yet to be dispersed? Because that could really affect the economy in 2022 and even 2023.
Well, I would say that, almost all of the money that could be allocated or obligated has been. I think it is a more complicated question on how much has hit the economy. I think the thing that is comforting is that we're not in a situation like we were in the Obama years where when we ran into bumps in the road, as you remember, those bumps were Greece, Europe, the Arab Spring raising gas prices. We had to go back and ask unsuccessfully for more funds so that states weren't laying off people, contracting. Here, the funds allow that state and local governments to be at strength, to implement longer term plans. We're trying to get them to accelerate those on jobs and workforce and retention right now. So I think that puts us in a much stronger situation. You may see us talking about having to go back in a particular area on health, et cetera, or more resources. But overall, I think the power and wisdom of the American Rescue Plan was that it had two focuses: to jumpstart strong growth, but also provide the flexibility to deal with lingering impacts. And if you take schools, we'd like to see some of the places accelerate their funds, but we also realize that those funds need to be used to keep schools open and safe, and do so right now. But we also need those school districts to have plans to deal with the learning loss, which is not going to be taken care of in a few months, but is an important negative lingering impact of this pandemic.
Okay, thank you so much, Gene. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. That's Gene Sperling. He's senior advisor to President Biden. Still to come, we're going to get to talk with the head of New York-Presbyterian, Dr. Stephen Corwin, about where we are in our fight against COVID. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The markets have been adjusting to prospects of higher rates this week, and it's hit tech particularly hard, although today maybe it's bouncing back a little bit. But let's check in now with Kriti Gupta about exactly what's going on. Kriti?
Well, you still see a little bit of pressure in tech, a little bit of a tug of war. We were up as much as 1% in intraday trading. Then you saw those gains kind of pared back. And a lot of this does have to do with what you were just saying, the pressure on tech. We did hit a 10% technical correction when it comes to the NASDAQ. So some of this is simply buying the dip on that, like I said, correction. That being said, it's important to see what comes after, because after it drops below another technical move, which is, of course, its 200-day moving average, the returns there are actually pretty muted. So right now, it kind of looks like historically you do see some of that bump, and about a year later, but only 7% returns. Compare that to the returns you've seen in the last 3 years, and you can really see that tech is going to be facing some of that pressure if it follows the historical trend. Right now, though, tech just playing a little bit of tug of war. Can it attract those bids as we price in more rate hikes?
Well, that's the question. What's going on with the rates right now with the 10-year?
Yeah, well, we know for sure that rates have been, or the bond market has been pricing in a fourth rate hike now. So that's going to be crucial. The question is, are they pricing in a 50 basis point rate hike in March? And that's the speculation that there is, because if you look at the euro-dollar strip, essentially in the money markets, they're pricing in 27 basis points. So they're pricing in more than one rate hike. Some people saying, is this the start of two? And of course, we know that as people price in more rate hikes, that of course hits those growth stocks.
So I'm not going to try to qualify you as a bond expert, but where's this two rate hikes in March, this 50 basis point come from? Is there any reason in evidence to suggest that? I mean, I know a couple of people speculated about it, but based on what?
It is purely speculation at this point. I mean, the last time it happened was in March of 2000. So this was a very long time ago. And there really isn't any basis for it. But the idea is that the bets on these rate hikes are so aggressive that they are pricing in more than one rate hike. And based on the assumption that rate hikes really only happen in these 25 basis point kind of pieces. Therefore, if it's more than one, then the next logical number would be a 50 basis point rate hike, especially as you see commodities continue to rise.
We will see. We'll see. March will tell us the tale. Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta for that report on the markets. Coming up here, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. We're going to talk with Stephen Irwin. He is the doctor who is in charge of NewYork-Presbyterian. We're going to talk to him about what's going on with the Omicron variant, particularly in New York and more broadly. That's coming up next. Dr. Steve Corwin. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The White House is set to release 400 million non-surgical N95 masks from the Strategic National Stockpile. Americans will be able to pick them up at tens of thousands of sites beginning late next week. The CDC updated its guidance on masks last week. It suggested that Americans wear N95 or KN95 masks. Booster shots with messenger RNA vaccines, such as those made by Pfizer and BioNTech, failed to block Omicron in a study of some of the first documented breakthrough cases caused by the highly contagious variant. All the cases studied by the South African researchers were mild or moderate, providing support for the extra shot's ability to fend off severe disease, death, and hospitalizations. The head of the World Health Organization is asking member states and donors for $480 million in additional funds for its next two-year budget period. Speaking at the WHO's budget meeting today, Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus said the program's original budget was $5.8 billion for 2021 and 2022, but he says the extra money is needed for additional emergency operations related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. We're going to continue now on that story of the pandemic and turn specifically to New York. Omicron cases may have crested in New York, even as they continue to rise elsewhere, but people still are getting sick at a rate that we cannot afford. For a view from the front lines, we welcome back now Dr. Steve Corwin. He's president and CEO of NewYork-Presbyterian. That is the #1 hospital in the New York area and ranked #5 nationwide. So, doctor, thank you so much for being back with us. Take us inside your hospital system. What are you seeing when it comes to Omicron and COVID?
We feel we peaked about a week ago. It's pretty flat right now, but we're still seeing a fair number of infections per day. Fortunately for us, despite the fact that we've had more than the last surge in the winter with Delta virus of last year, less patients requiring ICU care and less patients requiring ventilator care. About 50% of our patients are unvaccinated and 50% are vaccinated. Almost all of them double vaccinated as opposed to getting the booster. And it's the elderly, immunocompromised, and unvaccinated that comprise the ICUs in our system. So getting boosted is a big help.
So getting boosted is not a guarantee, but it's likely to keep you out of the hospital. Of the people who are coming to the hospital, how many of those people are coming in for COVID and how many are coming in for something else and then you test them and you find out they have COVID?
That varies over time. A few weeks ago, it was about 50% with COVID, 50% for COVID. Now it's pretty much people coming in for COVID. It's about 80-20. And last year during the Delta surge, it was 90% for COVID, 10% with COVID. So it's fluctuated some. Look, this is a very, very infectious variant. It's ubiquitous. A lot of people are getting it. I am sure that the positivity rate is higher because a lot of people aren't reporting it. A lot of people don't have access to testing. So we need to be very careful. And that's why the government handed out the N95 masks, which are protective.
At New York Presbyterian, is it changing what you can do in this sense? Are you having to forego some elective surgeries, some other things you would be doing because of the demands from COVID?
If we could delay something appropriately, yes, we've delayed that. We've shut down about 25 to 30% of our operating room capacity to make the capacity for COVID. But there are a lot of cases coming in that are quote unquote elective that really need to be done, whether it's a heart case, whether it's a neurosurgical case, whether it's a cancer case. So we have been able, thank God, to be able to deliver the care required by the community as well as the COVID care. But if you had an elective knee surgery operation or you're a young person who needs a hip replaced and can wait, we've asked people to wait.
Give us a sense of what it's doing with your staff. I know it's been an enormous burden on hospitals like yours. How are your doctors, how are your nurses, your other healthcare professionals, how are they holding up?
They're holding up well, but look, this is the third surge. People would have hoped that we were over it after surge 1 and then surge 2 last winter. And with the vaccine, I think people were really, really hoping that this wouldn't happen. So you have that. That being said, everyone has really bucked up and done a tremendous job. But you have to remember, you've had the great resignation, as you've reported on, David. You have a lot of people leaving healthcare. You have a lot of people who've gotten sick with this variant. We have really struggled with staffing, trying to hire traveling nurses, outside nurses. We are recruiting at a breakneck pace to get new graduate nurses and others into the institution. So it's been a big strain on the staff.
Stephen, at this point, can you have any sense of whether this might have longer-term repercussions for your ability to attract and retain some of the healthcare professionals you need?
I don't think so. I think that people really do want to go into healthcare. I think that they understand the importance of it. They understand how much the healthcare system has really helped the country get through this. I think we've gone through that wave of the resignation. I think people really do want to go into healthcare. I don't think there'll be a long-term effect, but boy, oh boy, it's been tough over the past couple of years. And I don't want to cry crocodile tears. It's been really, really tough on the frontline staff.
You warned us that there could well be another wave and there could be a variant. I'm not sure we were fully prepared for it. Maybe even at the governmental level, we weren't fully prepared. Let's assume for the moment there's another one after this. We don't know that there will be, but I don't think we can rule it out. What should we be doing right now to prepare for the next wave?
You and I have spoken about this, David. You have to take a just-in-case mentality as opposed to just-in-time. We purchased an entirely new warehouse right during the first wave in 2020. So we have adequate supplies of PPE. We have adequate supplies of just about everything, with the exception of some of the supply chain shortages that you see throughout the rest of the economy. But testing is really important. Getting the tests out to Americans is important. The masks are important. Making sure that we are continuing to discuss with the pharmaceutical companies another vaccine or a booster for the next variant. We don't know. We can't predict what's going to happen. But assuming the worst, usually, and hoping for the best is probably a better strategy than waiting to react to a problem. I think the testing problem really exacerbated this, to be honest with you.
Well, let's pursue that specifically, because the government right now is in the process of mailing out a lot of free tests around the country. I don't know that we were fully prepared for this. What should the government, because I'm not sure that NewYork-Presbyterian can take on this problem for New York, but what should the government doing in terms of stockpiling for the next one, these rapid tests?
Well, they should. The short answer is I don't know what they're doing to stockpile, but they ought to. My wife and I went on the website yesterday. It's very easy to order a test. And I think the government purchasing more and more of these tests is going to be critically important. Look, the antigen tests are not the be-all, end-all, but it helps. It helps to know if you're positive. And although we've had the debates around the country around masking, an N95 mask is pretty darn protective. And we see that in the institution. When our staff have the N95 masks on and they have their visors on, they're not getting infected in the hospital. They're getting infected in the community. So we know that these masks are effective. Stockpile the masks, stockpile the tests, make sure we have an adequate stockpile of ventilators. God forbid we have another serious variant. Make sure that the strategic stockpile is really well equipped to deal with the next pandemic. There will be another pandemic. When? Who knows? Will there be another wave of COVID? I don't know, but I wouldn't bet against it.
Okay, Doctor, it is always so terribly helpful to have you with us. That's Dr. Stephen Corwin. He's the CEO of NewYork-Presbyterian. Coming up, another crime in a synagogue. We talk with Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League about what happened last week in Texas. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Last Saturday, a British man broke into a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas during services, taking several hostages, including the rabbi. Ultimately, the hostages escaped and the assailant was killed by FBI agent. But this is just the latest instance of attacks on synagogues, raising questions about what is going on and what can be done about it. For some answers, welcome now Jonathan Greenblatt. He's CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. First of all, give us a sense of the scope of the problem. How big is the problem, and is it getting worse, getting better, or staying the same?
Well, David, I think that's the right question and the best place to start this conversation. But first, let me just say clearly how grateful we are that the 4 hostages all survived the incident without physical harm, and the gratitude we have for the FBI and all of law enforcement that really helped to make that possible, accompanied by the heroism of that rabbi. Look, anti-Semitism has been described as the world's oldest hatred, and indeed it remains a perennial issue. The ADL is the largest anti-hate group in the United States. We've been fighting this issue for more than 100 years. And I can tell you that we track anti-Semitic incidents. We're a very data-driven organization. We've been collecting this data for more than 40 years through a network of field offices in close coordination with law enforcement. So what I can tell you is that in 2020, it was the 3rd highest total of anti-Semitic incidents we've ever seen. And that was after 2019, the highest year on record. Now, we're tracking acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence, and all those indicators have been moving up since about the year 2016. And this comes, as you know, as often is said, anti-Semitism is a canary in a coal mine for other forms of hate. And indeed, according to the FBI, hate crimes were up 12% overall the last time they counted. So we're dealing with a national, what I would characterize as a national crisis.
Jonathan, are you comfortable that we have a sufficient and effective definition of hate crimes, whether it's anti-Semitism or otherwise, for you to use, but you just mentioned the FBI, for the Justice Department to use?
It's a great question. So we think about hate crimes as misdemeanors or felonies committed against an individual or an institution based on an immutable characteristic like religion or race or gender, something that a person can't easily change. I think that definition is adequate, but not necessarily, if you will, sufficient to the issues. So, for example, this person who went into this synagogue and held these people hostage, he did so, he said, seeking the release of a woman, an al-Qaeda terrorist who's being held for almost 90 years in a federal prison. She herself was arrested because she shot at American soldiers and surveilled American institutions. But when she stood in the courtroom, she asked that, quote unquote, Israelis and Zionists be excluded from her jury pool. Literally. So oftentimes the word Zionist is used as a synonym for Jew. And that's wrong. And so we need to make sure that our definitions of hate crime accommodate the way hate adapts and evolves. And whether you dehumanize Jewish people or the Jewish state, it puts all Jews at risk, whether they are, praying in the pews or shopping at a supermarket or dropping off their kids at Hebrew school.
Jonathan, turn for a moment to what can be done about this. First of all, are you satisfied with efforts being made by the Department of Justice right now in this regard?
Well, I must say, I've heard from, DHS Secretary, AG Garland. They're doing really good and important work, David, and yet more absolutely needs to be done because we can't arrest our way out of hate. We've also got to change hearts and minds. And I think that starts with you call out hate when you see it, whether it happens from the left or the right. Right? We need conservatives to call out hateful, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories when it comes from the right. And we need progressives to call out hateful, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories when they come from the left. So it starts there. And I think, secondly, we need a whole of society strategy. David, I got to tell you here on Bloomberg TV, companies have a role to play too.
I was just going to ask you that very question. What is the role of companies, and are some companies stepping up?
Well, look, before running ADL, I've served as an executive at several publicly traded companies. I founded some and sold others. So I really think I know the business world pretty well. And yeah, there's a role for businesses. So number one, every company should make sure your DEI program addresses issues of anti-Semitism. Very simple. Number two, to this issue of definitions you asked about, David, companies should adopt the standard definition of anti-Semitism that's been adopted by the U.S. government, dozens of other countries as well. It's called the IRA definition. And number three, you should have a Jewish employee resource group or a Jewish affinity group. Make sure that things like Jewish American Heritage Month and other religious observations are recognized. So from the DEI issues to definitional issues to Jewish ERGs, those are steps companies can take.
And finally, Jonathan, I wonder whether this problem is exacerbated by social media and, dare I say it, the metaverse as we go into it. I mean, as you say, it's the oldest hate crime there is. At the same time, social media facilitates the exchange of some pretty hateful things. And goodness knows, I can't quite imagine what we would have in terms of hate crimes on a metaverse.
Good. David, I'm so glad you asked. I worked for many years in Silicon Valley, and I really believe in the power of tech. But I must say, social media has been a cesspool of anti-Semitism and hate. It's literally brought, if you will, the lunatic fringe from the lunatics from the fringe into the center of the conversation. Facebook, I mean, we fight that kind of hate at ADL. We have a center in Silicon Valley that we opened. It's run by an executive from Reddit. But it's unmistakable to note that Facebook and Instagram, these are machines of malevolence in many ways. That's why ADL organized a program on Facebook a few years ago called Stop Hate for Profit. And McDonald's and Levi's and Coca-Cola, Starbucks, they all joined us and got off Instagram and Facebook and put pressure once and for all. And more needs to be done to deal with hate on social media.
Are the social media companies willing to step up and do the tough stuff to get it done? Or really is it paying more, forgive me the expression, lip service?
Different companies respond differently. I mean, we work with everyone from Amazon to Zoom and everybody in between. I have found that Apple is very good. I have found that Reddit tries very hard. I have found that Amazon tries. I have found that Facebook is probably the worst offender. Twitter as well, not too great. YouTube tries pretty hard. So I think it's a mixed bag. TikTok seems to be making an effort, but look, all of it needs to be addressed. And if the companies won't do it themselves, which would be my preference, the government needs to intervene. And basically, my belief is simple, David. The company should follow the same liability guidelines that you have at Bloomberg TV. You know, if you slander someone on Bloomberg TV, you could be sued, not on Facebook. That's got to change once and for all.
Jonathan, I'm going to try to squeeze one in very quickly here. What about mental illness and its role in this? We just had this horrible instance involving an Asian woman on the subway who was killed over the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, look, we stand with the AAPI community. The hate crimes directed against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are awful. The death of this young 40-year-old woman was shameful. Look, mental illness is a societal problem we need to address. But if you intentionally push over a woman or go into a synagogue because you think Jews control the world, that's evil. Yeah. And we need to make sure those people are arrested and prosecuted.
Well said. Thank you so much for being with us. That's Jonathan Greenblatt, president of the Anti-Defamation League. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. A short time ago, I spoke with Paul Jacobs. He's former chairman and CEO of Qualcomm about the semiconductor shortage and how to solve the problem.
I would say, though, that it is important to build more semiconductor fabs, and it's important not just for the making of the chips, but also the packaging of the chips, the testing of the chips. But even beyond that, it's all the little components that go around it, the boards. I mean, we really... we have an issue where there were very few suppliers. There was a broad range of products out there that and components that people needed, and all of this led to a lack of resiliency, a lack of ability to adapt to these big shocks that might happen in the system.
Are we on a path, Paul, in your judgment, to coming out of that challenge? Because you mentioned the concentration. TSMC is the biggest producer, as I understand, of microchips around the world. They've just announced a major new investment in new fabrication facilities. We have Intel saying we're going to go back into fabrication, not just design. Are we going to come out of this with a more diversified portfolio of suppliers, or just two or three big ones getting bigger?
I think we're going to have mostly two or three big ones getting bigger. It's very, very expensive to build a new fab. It's $5 to $15 billion. It takes a couple of years of investment before you get that. You get a return on it because you're starting to build chips through it. It is definitely true that the big guys are going to invest and build more fabs, and they're going to build more fabs in different places as well. So we'll get some geographical diversity. But then you worry, are we going to have this boom and bust cycle where right now there's too much demand for the supply, and then supply gets overbuilt, and then all of a sudden there's too much supply for the demand. Now, that may not happen here. There's people on both sides of this issue because, of course, as I said earlier, digitalization of things is happening. Electronics is getting embedded in so many things. New things are coming up. Obviously, work from home caused a big demand for computing products, the cloud. All of this AI and machine learning stuff is creating it, digitalization of automobiles and factories. And I mean, just so much stuff is going on that can create more demand. So it's not clear that this is going to be an oversupply situation in a couple of years, but that has happened in the past in the semiconductor industry.
You can watch more of my conversation with Paul Jacobs this Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Wall Street Week. I'll also be joined by former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and Sarah Ketterer and Liz Saunders. In our second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, we'll talk with Stephen Brill of NewsGuard. And this is Bloomberg.